Yes, good afternoon. This is July 29th, 2019. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Uh, what today I want to talk about is black bears. Oh yeah, I wanted to ask to don't forget to like and maybe subscribe. I've been forgetting to do that. But I want to talk about black bear, a subject that's near and dear to my heart, as I became the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department's first black bear biologist in October of 1978. So I got to work with black bears most of my career, a 31 plus year career at the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. But I also want to talk about a little bit about a historical perspective of black bears that goes way back before my time. So one of the books I like to delve into, and it's really one of the Bibles of wildlife here in New Hampshire, is The History of New Hampshire Game and Fur Bearers by Helena Silvers. She wrote this book. It was published in the late 50s, I think 1957, 58, but it really is the go-to book on the history of game and fur bearers in New Hampshire. And I have enjoyed reading this on wildlife in New Hampshire for decades. Well, black bears were really kind of it was an animal that people really didn't like from the very beginning. In fact, the early colonists I was reading in this book in the 1600s paid the Native Americans in Dover, New Hampshire, money to kill off the bears around the compound. And that persecution was to remain for the next 300 years. So from the early 1600s right into the mid 1900s, late 1900s, bears were persecuted to oblivion. And in fact, according to the historical perspective here, black bears by the early 1800s were pretty much eliminated from 3/4 of New Hampshire. Black bears remain pretty much in some numbers in the northern three counties, Co-ops, Carroll, and Grafton, but were essentially eliminated in the rest of the state by the 18 teens. And but there are some historical perspective here that I find very interesting. It was the bounties paid by the state for anyone who killed a black bear and presented it to the state. Now, this bounty actually went on for probably beginning in the mid-1700s, but the records that they were able to find pretty good copies of were available in 1882. So in 1882, 80 bears were bountied here in New Hampshire. In 68 and 1883, 100 in 1888. So, here in 1892, 200. So the bounty varied from $5 to $20, but $5 or $10 in the 1800s, early 1900s was a lot of money. So, if you were able to go out and kill a bear and provide a week's or a month's salary, you'd do that. So bears were really persecuted. 1907, only 49 bears. 1908, only 30 bears were bountied that whole year. So bounty continued until 1956. In 1955, when legislation was proposed to eliminate the bounty on bears, bears seemed to come out of the woodwork. There were 449 bears bountied that year. But I know from other folks that told me about when there used to be a bounty on porcupines, you could take one porcupine, you were supposed to cut off the nose and take it to the local town clerk. Well, they would cut off individual toes, so one porcupine would make 10 porcupines to get the 50-cent bounty. So probably the same thing was happening with bears in 1955 when the threat of removing the bounty was undertaken. And in 1956, only 119 bears were bountied, and that ended actually June 30th, 1956. And the records here said that there were probably another 76 bears taken that year. So under 200 bears were taken in the 1956, and very seldom was there more than 150 bears taken in that nearly 100 years of when the records here are available, or 60 years. So bears were basically killed off beginning in the 1600s until 1956. And I think the fellow that hired me, Henry Laramie, was a game biologist in the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department who had an early interest in black bears. And I'm pretty sure he had a lot to do with removing that bounty. But you could still kill bears year-round until 1964 and kill as many as you wanted until 1970. So just 8 years later, from when you could kill as many bears as you want, they hired the first black bear biologist in New Hampshire, which happened to be me. And so I began to do some research on black bears. I collected bear teeth for aging them. And by the early 80s, I think 1983, I estimated we had around 1,000 bears in New Hampshire, maybe 1,200, but certainly not a big population. Well, I continued to research bears. I began tagging bears with the assistance of the New Hampshire Bear Hunters Association. And in 1985, we were able to convince the New Hampshire legislators, our 400 plus body of legislators, to authorize the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department to regulate bear hunting. It took a lot of effort from the New Hampshire Wildlife Federation, the New Hampshire Bear Hunters Association, so there were a lot of participants in pushing for the legislation that gave the Fish and Game Department the authority to regulate bear hunting. And that year, I actually proposed that we eliminate the season. It had been statewide from the early beginning, and even in 1965, when there was a season, it was statewide, and that happened until 1985, when I proposed that we close the southern 7 counties, and the only remaining northern counties, where there were some numbers of bears, should be open, and only for a 1-month season. So my research in the early 80s suggested we had about 1,000 bears, but you know what, by 1984, 83, 84, there are no older females older than age 6. And it's those older females that typically produce 3 cubs and are good enough parents to bring those cubs to yearling size. So basically the population was still in decline until at least 1985, with there being about 1,000 bears. So we closed the bear season to 1 month, closed 3/4 of the state. By the early 90s, the bear population began to grow, and by the 2000s, we had probably 5,000 bears in New Hampshire. The current estimate is about 5,500 bears. But in the 80s, when I was doing the bear research, the kill, until we reduced the season in 1985, was around 200 bears a year. But when we closed the season and turned the population around, it began to grow, and by 2000, by 1999, 499 bears were killed, 449 in 2000, 803, a record number, in 2003. The record was broken by 812 in 2012, 898 in 2016, and last year, in the fall of 2018, 1,053 bears were killed by hunters in New Hampshire. That is more bears than we had in the population when I first started working with bears. So black bears have come a long ways. Now, how did we grow the population? Well, several things. We actually started a whole program in 1985 and 86 called Something's Brewing in New Hampshire, or by the early 90s at least. So basically, in 1990, here's another thing. 1990, thanks to the New Hampshire Bear Hunters Association again and the New Hampshire Wildlife Federation, legislation passed that created a bear license. So in order to kill a bear, you needed to purchase a $5 bear permit, and the proceeds from that license was used to further research bears. And one of the first things I did was work with the University of New Hampshire. We actually used satellite imagery to map bear habitat in the state and to get a sense of where our bear numbers could grow. And sure enough, there was a lot of habitat in Cheshire and Sullivan County and parts of Merrimack County. So we knew we had the habitat to grow bears, so we continued that shortened season and allowed the bears to repopulate these counties where they'd been extirpated more than 100 years before. So we actually measured habitat, and then we kicked off a campaign to teach people how to live with bears. When I first worked with bears, some would have a bear come hit their bird feeder or their beehives, and the next night they would kill it. So it was a common thing in the 70s and 80s to kill nuisance bears. And by kicking off this Something's Brewing campaign and telling people, well, you got to take your bird feeders down, you got to take care of your trash, you got to put an electric fence around your beehives, we put the blame of bear problems on the people. So it's funny, when I finally got calls in the 1990s about a bear coming and taking down somebody's bird feeder. Well, I know we were supposed to take the bird feeder down, and my husband threatened to kill the bear, but we're not going to kill the bear. So the whole shift of the mindset in New Hampshire happened because of our campaign to teach people to live with bears. Something's brewing in New Hampshire. We've got bears, and now there are more bears in New Hampshire than there have been since colonial times or before. So over 5,000 bears. 5,500 is the current estimate. I've had them here in my backyard numerous times. I've seen multiple bears. So New Hampshire has more bears. You've got a better chance of seeing a black bear in New Hampshire than your great or great grandfather or grandmother. So bears are numerous. Yeah, take those bird feeders down. You got to learn to live with bears. We got more than ever now, and I'm very grateful for that.